On October 22, 1907, the overnight lending rate on the New York Stock Exchange hit 100%, and the man deciding which banks survived the night was not a senator, not a Treasury official, but a private banker judging the books by lamplight in his own library. His name was J.P. Morgan. The panic passed. The lesson the country drew from it seemed obvious. Never again should the fate of the American economy rest in one financier's hands. So Congress built the Federal Reserve, a public institution meant to tame Wall Street for good. That's the version taught in classrooms. But the story most people were told leaves out where the blueprint actually came from, because the plan that became America's central bank wasn't written in Congress. It was written in secret by 6 of Morgan's own circle. And the receipt for that bargain is still being paid off today. To understand why that secret mattered, you have to understand how exposed the country was without it. In the autumn of 1907, the United States was the only major financial power on earth without a central bank. When a panic hit, there was no public authority to inject cash, no lender of last resort, nothing but the private fortunes of a few men on Wall Street. The trigger was a failed scheme to corner the copper market. It rippled outward until it reached the Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of the 2 or 3 largest trusts in New York. Depositors lined up. Morgan sent in a team of young bankers, one of them Benjamin Strong, to open Knickerbocker's books and judge whether it could be saved. They spent half a day inside the numbers. Morgan decided the trust was too far gone and refused to lend. On October 22nd, Knickerbocker shut its doors. The call money rate leapt from 9.5% to 70%, then to 100% in 2 days. Picture a shopkeeper reading the next morning's headline over breakfast, watching the safety of his own savings rise or fall on the mood of one man. Morgan stopped the bleeding. He herded the surviving trust presidents into rooms and forced them to prop each other up. On October 29th, he bought $30 million of New York City bonds to keep the city itself from going bankrupt. It worked. And that was exactly the problem. Because the Republic had just been rescued by a private citizen who answered to no voter. Newspapers praised him. Congress was quietly horrified. The lesson seemed clear, and everyone repeated it. America needed a public system so it would never again depend on the whim of one banker. So who would build that public cure, and who would be allowed in the room? The man who stepped forward was Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, the most powerful Republican in the Senate. In May of 1908, Congress passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act and created an 18-member National Monetary Commission with Aldrich as its chair to study how to prevent the next 1907. Aldrich sailed to Europe, toured the central banks of England, France, and Germany, and came home convinced America needed one of its own. But by the fall of 1910, Aldrich had a problem: 2 years of study and no actual plan. Congress would reconvene in weeks, and he had nothing to hand them. He had built his career as a public servant. His deepest ties ran to Wall Street, and the reform meant to restrain the bankers was a bill he could not write without them. This was the promise the public was being sold: a check on the money trust, an end to the panics that wiped out ordinary depositors, a financial system finally answerable to the nation. Progressives across the country cheered the idea. In debate halls, the very word reform drew applause. Everything the public was promised is on the record. But the strongest reversal in this story is still ahead, and it sits inside a magazine confession that took 25 years to surface. Subscribe before we get there, because the moment it lands, the whole official version changes shape. What no one applauding knew was that the promise had already been written down in a place no voter could see. So who do you invite to secretly draft the law meant to rein you in? For Aldrich, the answer was the men who understood money best, which meant the men the reform was supposed to constrain. He knew that if their names surfaced, the bill was dead on arrival, so he told them to come to a New Jersey train terminal one at a time, after dark. In November 1910, 6 men boarded a private railroad car and rode south. Aldrich, his secretary, Arthur Shelton, Assistant Treasury Secretary A. Piatt Andrew, Henry Davison, a partner at J.P. Morgan, Frank Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank, and Paul Warburg of the investment house Kuhn Loeb. They agreed to use only first names for the entire trip. Later, they would call themselves the First Name Club. One reportedly carried a borrowed shotgun to sell the cover story, A Gentleman's Duck Hunt. Their destination was Jekyll Island, a private club off the Georgia coast, whose members included Morgan himself. The regular staff were sent away and replaced with servants brought in from the mainland, people who could not recognize a senator or a banker if they tried. For 9 days, behind those doors, 6 private men wrote the architecture of America's money. And here is the fact that recasts everything before it. The pages they carried off that island became almost unchanged, the Aldrich Plan, presented to Aldrich's own public commission in January 1911 as if the commission had produced it. It proposed a National Reserve Association governed by a board of some 46 members, of whom only about 6 would be appointed by the government. The rest would answer to the banks. The public held almost no stake at all. For over 20 years, the men in that railroad car said nothing. Then, in the February 9, 1935 issue of the Saturday Evening Post, Frank Vanderlip wrote it down himself. He admitted he had been, in his own words, as furtive as any conspirator. He called that secret trip the actual conception of the Federal Reserve System. The letter was the promise. The ledger was the truth. And yet, this is where the paranoid version of the story gets it wrong. In the same confession, Vanderlip insisted the 6 of them believed they were doing patriotic work, not pulling off a heist. The panic of 1907 had been real. The absence of a central bank had been real. These were not cartoon villains. They were men solving a genuine crisis in a way that also happened to serve them. More than one thing was true at once, but secrecy leaves a stain. When the Aldrich Plan reached Congress, its origins clung to it. Critics called it a surrender to the money trust. Country bankers who might have benefited opposed it too, certain it would hand the Northeast's big banks control over everyone else. A Republican plan tied to Wall Street and a Congress turning against both. It was doomed. So how did its skeleton still end up as law? The election of 1912 changed everything. Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, won the presidency, and his party took Congress. The banker-written Aldrich Plan was dead, but a Virginia congressman named Carter Glass, working with the economist H. Parker Willis, took its bones and rebuilt them into a system of regional banks rather than one central body. Glass, like Aldrich, wanted the bankers to keep most of the control. Wilson refused. He demanded a governing board appointed entirely by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Public oversight seated on top of the private structure. He believed no bill handing government so little control would survive or deserve to. So it was not a heist. It was a hostage negotiation. On December 22, 1913, the House passed the final act 298-60. The next day the Senate followed 43-25, and Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. The bankers did not celebrate. The New York Times complained the law handed too much political control to the government. Both sides walked away feeling robbed, which tells you what the fight had really been about. Not the panic of 1907. That was the excuse. The real prize was the lever itself, control over money and credit, over who gets rescued in the next crisis and who is allowed to fail. The map of 12 regional banks was the compromise, but stitched inside it was something that never came out. The human cost went unrecorded. Charles Barney, the President Knickerbocker forced out as it failed, shot himself on November 14, 1907. Country bankers watched power drift toward New York. And ordinary Americans, the people the reform was named for, would not learn for another 20 years that the law protecting them had been drafted in secret by the very interests it claimed to check. A country banker could read the finished act in his newspaper and feel he'd lost something he couldn't name. That hidden half never left. Here is the principle underneath all of it. A central bank is leverage, the power to decide, in a crisis, who lives and who dies financially. The genius of the Jekyll Island design was to wrap that private machinery inside public authority so the country would trust it. That wasn't a flaw in the plan. That was the plan. So who owns the Federal Reserve today? The answer is stranger than either side admits. Those 12 regional reserve banks are still legally private corporations owned by their member banks, which are required to hold stock they cannot sell, trade, or pledge in exchange for a fixed 6% dividend. A federal court once described them as private corporations in which the government has an interest. The Board of Governors is a public agency. The profits flow to the Treasury, and yet the ownership structure sketched on that island in 1910 is still the law of the land. In 2008, when the system cracked again, the Federal Reserve stepped in to backstop the same Wall Street it had been built around, the descendants of the very houses that sent men south on that train. Its balance sheet now runs to roughly $6.5 trillion. The rail car of 1910 and the ownership map of today are the same drawing, still in force. Picture that private library in 1907, one man deciding the fate of a nation's banks. Now picture a trading floor a century later, waiting on a decision from an institution those same men designed. The room changed. The logic didn't. If you're drawn to the hidden power structures underneath the history we're handed, the parts that quietly shape the present, subscribe, because that's the only thing this channel does. Then tell me below, 100 years on, is a central bank owned by the banks it regulates a betrayal of what 1913 promised, or the uneasy compromise that keeps the whole thing standing? That's the question those 6 men left us. I'll read the answers.